Okay, I can see a few people have joined, so we might get started. So hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today for our latest HashiCorp snapshot titled Secret Zero, Mitigating the Risk of Secret Introduction with Vault, which will be presented by Cameron Heismans, Regional Manager for Solutions Engineering at HashiCorp. So today, Cam is going to walk us through the use of AppRole authentication in Vault and how it addresses the challenge of Secret Zero. Before we launch into the snapshot, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. First of all, just letting you know that this session is being recorded and the recording will be made available to you within the next day or two. I'll send out an email follow-up with that link. So today's session will last about 15, maybe 20 minutes. And to keep to that 15-minute time frame, we'll ask that if you do have any questions, just pop them into the chat window down there, and we'll get to those at the end. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Over to you, Cam.
Awesome, thanks, Pete. Before we get into Secret Zero, I thought it'd be good to set a little bit of context here. So, if you think about the last 20 years, I think most organizations have settled on, ITIL as a framework for how they do planning, changing, releasing of code, of infrastructure into their environment. If we fast forward a little bit and they shift to establishing new systems of engagement with their customers or people like that, I think most people have adopted this cloud operating model. And just because of the cloud operating model doesn't mean they drop ITIL altogether. They tend to just adapt it for this new model. And so what we typically see is, a framework that looks something like this. So a customer might have some sort of dynamic system that they, update constantly. They'll build an architecture to suit that. So think, something like Nomad or, Kubernetes or some sort of immutable, container style scheduled architecture. And then any change that happens to that system is typically done as code, right? If we think about historically how people have done this, it's definitely via some sort of privileged access management tool, maybe via some sort of two-factor authentication. They've said, this is how you can do changes. And then in this new environment, the way that you build out things like resiliency, availability is all via, live system changes, possibly behind some sort of feature flag, but also through scripts or codification. And all of that is done via, code, right? So automation drives everything in that environment. And it's all, some sort of process-oriented way. Finally, you get to this high level of service abstraction with, virtualization, containers, etc. And so if every step is driven by code, then every step in that process needs to be, some sort of attribution and trust in that model, right? We need to attribute these code changes to something, typically, a machine. So if every step is attributed to these machines, then it stands to reason that we need to give them some sort of identity. Within the cloud, this is made relatively simple, right? If you think about standing up an instance in any of the major clouds, then you can easily attribute some sort of identity via maybe IAM or some sort of native authentication, Active Directory, etc. And that allows you to say this machine is doing this task. The challenge becomes, or the problem becomes harder when we drill a bit further into those machines. Maybe on that machine, we might be running a config management tool. Maybe it's a CI/CD tool, right? All of them need to still have some sort of unique identity. The question is, how can we get a unique identity to these systems? At this point, we might introduce Vault into the picture, right? I have a Vault on the right-hand side of the diagram, and I've configured Vault in such a way that I've got some secrets already populated, right? So I'd have some secrets at a path like, app A, app B, at a landscape like prod, dev, or test. And essentially what I'd want to do, with my pipeline as an example, so this could be, an Ansible playbook, this could be a, pipeline in any, common configuration tool. What I'd essentially want to do is give only that pipeline access to some of these secrets. The challenge then becomes is I wrap this pipeline via some sort of entity, right? So I say that GitLab is running, as an example, GitLab is running, in my on-premises infrastructure, or it's running in SaaS, right? And then we kind of conform then to those same, constructs of identity, right? So the construct, if I ran, in AWS, would be that I'd choose AWS IAM, right? And what I'd get then is the inability to distinctly or discretely manage access to secrets, right? So for the pipeline app A, to get access to app A, I'd need to have one role. And then for pipeline B, I'd need to have, another role. And ultimately what I'd do is I'd be giving, kind of like God mode to my CI/CD tool so that they could access any secrets from any pipeline, right? This is not really what we want because it doesn't conform to that notion of least privilege. Essentially what I want is, any application pipeline to be able to get access to only the secrets it needs access to, maybe at a certain point in the pipeline or only at a certain time within the pipeline itself, right? So the question then becomes not only how can we get unique identity to this system, but how can we get unique identity to the pipeline itself, right? And there's a few different ways we could do this. We could use something like a PKI cert. We could create a token within Vault and give that a scope to be able to access the secret. We could use something like AppRole. Even with something like GitLab, there's the notion of creating JWTs, which can be, tightly scoped. I think, the problem certainly with the first two is, how do we protect these, right? A token is a secret in itself. So how do we protect that secret in the pipeline? And this is really the genesis of that, secret zero problem, right? To get access to the secrets, I'm giving you another secret. So you need to protect that. To protect that secret, you end up in this inception kind of paradigm, right? For the case of GitLab, I'd certainly recommend something like, the JWTs. But if your CI/CD tool doesn't have them, then what can you do? Well, the answer is AppRole, right? And this is something I'm going to cover in a little bit more detail. When I cover this in detail, I'm going to choose GitLab as the tool, but really you could take this whole method and apply it to Ansible, Chef, Puppet, or even your favorite CI/CD tool. So what is AppRole? So AppRole is really a way that Vault allows things that don't have an identity to be given one. And it does that via a trusted broker method, right? That trusted broker method introduces two main concepts. This idea of a role ID, which could be thought of as maybe a username, and the idea of a secret ID, which is akin to a password, right? And so what we do as the trusted broker is we bring these two things together, the role ID and the secret ID. We bring them together at the exact point in time where we want something to be able to authenticate to Vault, right? Where a client would need to authenticate to Vault. And so the onus of trust is put on us, to help bring these two things together in a very secure way. So what we end up with then is three main players, right? We have obviously, the Vault service. We've got, the broker, a trusted system to broker that authentication. In the example that I'm going to go through, this would be our pipeline. And then ultimately we have the secret consumer, right? The final thing or entity to consume the secret, right? In this case, it's going to be the runner for our pipeline, but like I said before, it could be, part of your playbook or part of some other discrete system. So to begin the configuration, the first thing we'll do is we'll log into Vault. And really to do that, we choose some sort of Vault admin style persona, right? The first thing that you do as that admin is you'd go and mount the AppRole authentication engine. We might go and create our first AppRole, and you can see here that I've given that a name. It'd be a very unique name, and I've given it a policy. And then I've given it a token TTL. So if anyone authenticates with the AppRole, what I want to say is the time they've got to be able to use that token is 15 minutes. If they want to look at the secret ID, they can only use that once within that period. And the TTL for that secret ID is 1 minute. So there's some configuration we can put around the AppRole itself to try and make its consumption more secure as well. That policy that I talked about earlier is then created too. And this allows something that's authenticated with the AppRole to get access to a certain path within Vault. So in this example, I've said the path is secrets, app A, and then prod, right? And then all it can do is read secrets from that path. It can't update them, change them, or anything like that. I'm then going to go and create another policy. Right? And this policy will be used to provide access only to the secret ID for this AppRole, right? So any token that gets associated with this policy can have the ability to only get the secret ID. And we'll see how that manifests a bit later. Finally, the last thing the Vault admin would do is create that role ID and pass it to the runner, right? In this example, I've done this as a manual step, but you could quite easily automate this via some sort of golden image API building thing. Like maybe you use Packer to build your golden images, or maybe use another tool to do that. You could easily do that with the Vault API and that other tool. So essentially now what I've done with AppRole is I've configured the whole thing. I've grabbed only the role ID and I've put it in the runner. In the next part of the process, we'll typically use someone like our SRE, right? They'd be the person who would manage that configuration of their pipelines. I'm going to allow this person to log into Vault, and as part of one of the policies that I give them is the ability to create tokens, right? And so what I'm going to get them to do is to log into Vault and create a token, except this token is going to only have that policy we created earlier, that ability to see the secret ID, right? So I do that, and then I get the SRE to go and configure the pipeline for the project itself, right? Some of the key things that they'll do for that is configure the environment variables for the Vault address. Obviously, that'd be where Vault is located, and another environment variable called the Vault token. Right? The value of that Vault token would be the token we just created earlier. Once again, this process could be automated as well, right? So if your CI/CD tool had the ability to change this environment variable via the API, you could easily do that. This token itself could also be longer lived, right? This token could be valid for a period of maybe 30 days because in and of itself, it doesn't give the user much scope, right? They can only view the secret ID. So now I've got my runner configured and it's got the role ID, right? I have my pipeline kind of configured in the sense that I've told it where Vault is and I've given it an initial token with very limited scope. And obviously I've got Vault out in the mix. So as part of kicking off my pipeline, my runner will go ahead and using the Vault address and using that Vault token, request from Vault that secret ID as part of the app role. Instead of returning the secret ID, I can configure Vault to return a new token, right? This will provide access to a cubby hole or a small, section within Vault, a very discrete, kind of hole, if you will, that allows what we call response wrapping, right? So we do this to prevent any kind of accidental disclosure of a secret within Vault. Right? So logically speaking, this response, which would have typically been the secret ID via HTTP, has been wrapped by Vault and this token, right? So for anything now to retrieve the value, they need to unwrap this token itself. This response wrapping mechanism provides a really powerful way to do information sharing, right? We essentially allow you to take all this information, feed it into some other system, maybe like Splunk or some other SIEM tool, and be consciously aware of attempts at interception or tampering. Why? Because this new token that I've given, the one that's highlighted in pink, can only be used once, right? I can make it valid for something like a short period of time. And I can say the only way you can get access is, or the only thing you can access is that cubbyhole, right? I could extend this even further and make it valid for a shorter period of time and get quite powerful with this. But essentially, this is a good mechanism to be able to detect if someone's doing something that they shouldn't be in trying to tamper with AppRole. So now we can use that new token, the pink one, we can use that to authenticate to Vault, and we can say, hey, Vault, I've got this token. Can you please unwrap it now and give me the response? The response would then be the secret ID, right? So give me that back. So now at this point, the runner has a token, right, that can't really do much except see the secret ID, right? So it's got that, it's got the role ID, and it can kind of use these things together now. So what we can do now is make a new authentication request to Vault, right? And this would be against the AppRole login that we created early on. And we can combine that secret ID and the role ID together to say, hey, Vault, please give me a new token. So upon success, Vault would say, hey, here's your new token. And now here's the permissions of that token, right? This token can only access what we said earlier, right? It can only access secrets, app prod, as an example, right? So now we can reintroduce that pipeline and say, hey, the pipeline is typically configured by some sort of dev, right? How does this dev go and interact with Vault, and what kind of logic would they need to know? Well, in actual fact, we could wrap up this pipeline into a quick function, this interaction between Vault, this AppRole stuff. We could wrap that up into a function, and we could say, hey, Mr. Dev or Mrs. Dev, you can go and use this at some point in your pipeline. And you'll see that more in the demo. And so essentially for the dev working within the pipeline itself, we've given them a tightly scoped introduction to Vault. They don't need God mode, so they don't need the ability to access anything, right? We haven't given them a token which should be considered secret in the sense that they need to protect it in some other way, right? All we're giving them or allowing them to see is either the username or the password. We never bring them together at the same time. And then we're not asking them to be masters of Vault, right? We could wrap this all up in a neat little script and say, hey, you could still write the things in your pipeline, but Vault will take care of everything else. So let's have a quick look at a demo. I'm going to bring across here my GitLab project. I've created a project called HashiCorp Snapshot AppRole. And within that project, I've got a single file, this GitLab file. Down the side here, I also have some settings for my CI/CD. Oops. So you can see a few key things. The first thing that you'll see is I've gone and built my own custom runner, right? This runner has a tag against it, meaning that for the project that's tagged app A, I'll use the custom runner. This is that runner that I talked about earlier. I've also got two environment variables configured. I talked about them earlier as well, which is the Vault address and that Vault token. Once again, these are probably things that will be configured less so via the person working within the pipeline and more about a pipeline project owner. Within the repository itself, I've got a single GitLab file, right? I'm going to break this down for you now. So I've created this function at the start, which is basically allowing me to authenticate to Vault. Within the runner itself, it's got access to Vault natively, so I can write native Vault CLI commands. I don't need to use the API, but you could easily, if it didn't have that available, you could easily use these commands via the API. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take that initial token that we gave, and I'm going to do that piece where I'm asking Vault to give me back, that secret ID, right? So I'm requesting that secret ID here with my initial token. What Vault returns to me is that, response wrapped token. So I'm going to grab that response wrap token and say, hey, please unwrap it, right? And return to me the secret ID. So I can do that. And then finally, when I've got the secret ID, I also have the role ID baked into my runner, so I can combine the role ID and the secret ID, and I can authenticate against my AppRole path, right? And essentially what I get back then is a client token that I'm going to save as Vault token, right? I've then got a few steps within my build. I've got a build step, and that first build step is just so I can highlight to you some things that Vault is doing. It's going to print out the role ID, the secret ID, the Vault token, and then just check Vault status, right? And we can see that I've tagged this app A, so it's going to use my runner. I've then got a second stage called the test stage. It's also going to use my runner, print out those same tokens, but it's then going to use my script to authenticate, right? So this is the part where I get my developer to insert the Vault authentication piece. Once it's authenticated, I'm then going to go and echo the role ID and the secret ID so we can see them changing as we work through the steps. And then finally, I'm going to go and get access to a secret. So if we go and drill down into our pipeline, once again, we'll see some steps. We'll see that build step. We can drill into this and see that, yep, this is running on my runner, which is local to my MacBook. We can see I'm printing out the role ID. It ends in D34. You can see I'm printing out the secret ID, and there's no value set just yet because I haven't brought them together yet. And I'm printing out that initial token, right? So at this point, there's not really a lot that I can do within Vault. If I switch over to my test part of my pipeline and drill a little bit deeper into that, you'll see that I can do the exact same things in terms of role ID, D34, no secret ID, vault token, but then I do that whole scripted piece to go and get myself the secret ID, the role ID, and authenticate to vault. So now my role ID stays the same, but now I've been able to introduce my secret ID, and you'll see here that this has a unique code at the end. This will be important a bit later. And I've got a vault token now, right? This token will be valid for about 15 minutes within this pipeline, and I can grab a secret from that path. Just to show that secret, authentication is tightly scoped, I'm going to go ahead and edit my pipeline really quickly. And I'll uncomment a few lines here. These next 2 lines are basically going to try and get a secret from a path that we didn't authorize already via our policy. All right. So let's just have a look at this running. You can see the build steps have completed. To be honest, there's no change here. My role ID is going to be the same, and my token is going to be the same. And that's what we'd expect. If I flick over to the test part, we can see the test has failed, but there's a few things that are pretty important. Role ID and token stay the same, and once again, secret ID was not known during the run until we did that AppRole authentication. You'll see that we have a new secret ID now because it was uniquely generated, and we have a new token because that's uniquely generated as well. We get access to our initial secret, then making a request to the dev portion of Vault, we get a permission denied, right? Because this hasn't been granted that access. So what we've seen here is the ability for me to really quickly go ahead and configure AppRole for Vault. Using AppRole, I've been able to mitigate that secret 0 problem by only bringing together the username and password, or the role ID and the secret ID together just in time via separate brokers, right? So I have a broker who brings together my role ID and a broker who brings together my secret ID, and those 2 entities are never the same. And then I've provided scoped access just in time to a secret within Vault. Back to you, Pete.